It was the middle of October, 2013, when I decided to take a short trip up north into the hills of Vermont. I was 34 back then, living alone in a small apartment in Burlington, tired of my job and the city noise. I wanted quiet, somewhere I could clear my head for a few days. A friend from work told me about a place near the edge of a lake where old cabins were scattered through the woods, most of them empty or half collapsed. He said people used to rent them back in the 70s, but now they were just sitting there, forgotten. It sounded like exactly the kind of silence I needed. I drove out early on a Friday morning. The air was cool and the leaves had already turned deep orange and brown. The road wound through thick forest, barely wide enough for one car in some stretches. After a while, the asphalt turned to gravel, and the trees started to look older, taller, like they'd been standing there long before anyone built anything. I didn't have a proper map, just a rough idea of where to go. The dirt road led down toward the lake, and after about half an hour, I spotted a narrow turnoff marked by a wooden sign that had rotted almost completely through. I followed it for maybe a mile until the trees opened up into a clearing. The lake lay beyond it, dark, still, reflecting the overcast sky like a piece of dull metal. A few yards from the water, half hidden behind tall weeds and brambles, was an old cabin. The roof sagged near the back, and one of the windows was broken. The front steps leaned to one side, but it was there, standing, and that was enough for me. I parked the car near the edge of the clearing and walked around to look it over. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and old wood. There was dust over everything and faint traces of animals. Mice droppings, old nests in the corners. A small table stood near the window, and a rusted stove sat in the corner. There was a narrow hallway that led to what looked like two small rooms. One was empty except for an overturned chair. The other had a metal-framed bed with a bare mattress, stained and torn. I decided I'd sleep in my sleeping bag on top of it anyway. I set up my stuff, opened the windows to air it out, and stepped outside to take a look around. The woods behind the cabin were dense, the kind that swallowed sound. The only noise was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional ripple of water against the shore. I walked along the lake for a while, then came back and started a small fire out front using the wood that was already stacked near the porch. Someone must have used the place not too long ago, maybe hikers or campers. As evening came, the woods got darker faster than I expected. By the time I finished eating, the fire was the only light around. I could see my reflection in the cabin window, faint and flickering. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be there completely alone. No cars, no lights, not even the distant hum of a highway, just black woods in every direction. When I went inside, I left the fire burning low outside for warmth. I had a flashlight, but I didn't use it much, just enough to check the corners and make sure no animals had gotten in. The cabin creaked every time I stepped, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Still, after lying down, I started to relax. The quiet was heavy, almost comforting. I must have dozed off for a while, because when I opened my eyes again, it was completely dark. The fire outside had burned out. My watch said 2:17 a.m. The first thing I noticed was how silent it was. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Then I heard it. A faint scrape, like something dragging lightly against wood, came from somewhere near the front porch. I stayed still for a few seconds, thinking it might have been a branch moving in the wind, but there was no wind. The sound came again, slow and steady. I sat up and listened harder. It stopped. I waited, not breathing, staring at the black outline of the window. After maybe a minute, there was a dull thump, like a footstep, then another. Someone, or something, was walking along the porch. I didn't move. I didn't even grab my flashlight. I just sat there watching the shadows. The steps stopped near the front door. The boards creaked under weight. Then everything went silent again. I must have stayed like that for a long time, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. After a while, I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer, and finally lay back down, though I didn't really sleep again that night. In the morning, I stepped outside. The ground was damp from dew, and the fire pit was cold. I looked at the porch. The first thing I saw was mud, footprints. Not clear ones, just smudges, but too big for any animal. They led up to the door and then back toward the tree line. I followed them for a few feet before they disappeared into the leaves. I didn't see anyone around, no tire tracks, no sign of a tent or camp. It made my stomach twist a bit, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe some hiker wandered close during the night. Still, it bothered me enough that I decided I'd only stay one more night. The day passed quietly. I tried to enjoy it, walking along the shore, cooking a bit of food, writing some notes in a small journal I carried. But I kept glancing at the tree line. Around dusk, I noticed something else. Across the lake, maybe 50 yards away, there was another cabin, smaller, almost hidden by trees. I hadn't seen it before. The lake was too wide to cross easily, and the light was fading fast, but I could make out the outline of the roof and a broken chimney. When night came again, I made sure to lock the door. Not that it would have stopped anyone determined to get in. I left my flashlight beside me and tried to fall asleep early. But around midnight, I woke again. There was a sound from outside, the same dragging noise, faint, slow. It moved along the wall toward the back of the cabin. Then, after a few seconds, I heard a low crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves just outside the window. My heart was beating so hard it felt like I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. The sound circled around, stopping near the porch again. Then something hit the wall, a single, dull knock. I stayed frozen, eyes on the window, waiting. After a few seconds, it stopped. I listened for what felt like hours until the first bit of light came through the cracks. When I finally stepped outside, I found the same muddy prints again, this time closer to the window. But what made me stop cold was a small thing sitting on the porch. A piece of torn fabric, maybe from a jacket or pants, dark and stiff with dried mud. Someone had been out there, not an animal, and whoever it was had come back twice. That morning, I packed up my things fast. I didn't bother cleaning up. I just wanted to get out of there. As I carried my bag to the car, I looked once more toward the lake. Across the water, at the edge of the trees, something moved. It was just a person, standing near that other cabin. They were too far away to see clearly, but they weren't moving, just watching. I don't know how long they'd been standing there, but I knew then that whoever it was had been the one walking around the cabin. I got into the car and drove off without looking back. The dirt road felt endless. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and even then, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the road behind me. When I finally got home, I told myself it was probably some drifter or hunter who'd been staying nearby, maybe curious or looking for supplies. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The way they moved around the cabin, the silence, the fact they never said anything, never came closer. It felt wrong, like they wanted me to know I wasn't alone but didn't want me to see them. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when it gets quiet. I don't go camping anymore. I can't even stand the sound of wind moving through trees. The image of that still figure across the lake, half hidden by shadows, has stayed with me for years. I can still see it clearly, the way it stood there, not moving, just watching. And I know for a fact that when I drove off that morning, I wasn't the only one awake in those woods. It was in the fall of 1994 when I decided to spend a few nights in an old cabin that sat behind a forgotten graveyard near the edge of a small town called Millhaven in northern Wisconsin. I was 31 back then, and I'd been working as a part-time groundskeeper for the local township. The cabin wasn't mine. It used to belong to an old caretaker who had looked after the graveyard decades ago. When he died, no one bothered with the place anymore. The small wooden structure had been left to rot, swallowed slowly by tall grass and damp air that smelled like wet earth and pine. I wasn't there for leisure. I was there because I needed a quiet place away from people, somewhere I could think and work without interruption. I was behind on some paperwork for the town, and my apartment in Millhaven was too noisy, wedged between a bar and a bus stop. The cabin stood just 50 yards behind the last row of gravestones, on a patch of uneven ground. The roof sagged in the middle, the windows were streaked with grime, and the air inside smelled like mold, old wood, and something faintly metallic, almost like rusted nails soaked in rainwater. I spent half a day cleaning it before I moved my things in. There was one small bed frame, a table, and a cast iron stove in the corner. Mice had chewed through some old sacks that were left behind, scattering bits of cloth and dried husks of grain all over the floor. The graveyard itself stretched out in front of the cabin like a sea of tilted stones and weeds. The oldest markers were nearly swallowed by dirt, their names barely visible. The first night was quiet except for the wind. It came from the north, cold and sharp, moving through the cracks of the cabin walls. I lay on the bed with a lantern on the table, its faint glow dancing against the wooden ceiling. I could hear branches tapping against the roof, and once or twice, a faint scrape came from beneath the floorboards. Probably rats or raccoons, I told myself, though the sound had a strange rhythm to it, like something slowly dragging. The second day, I walked through the graveyard with a rake, clearing some leaves and fallen branches. The soil was soft from rain, and my boots sank in slightly with every step. Some of the graves had collapsed in on themselves, leaving shallow depressions that filled with muddy water. There were no visitors. No one came to this part of town anymore except me. Beyond the graveyard was a thick tree line that led into the woods, and somewhere beyond that ran a small creek. I could hear it faintly at night if the wind was still. By the third night, the quiet had started to feel heavy. I was used to silence, but this one had weight. It wasn't peaceful. It pressed against my ears like something waiting to break it. I had just finished writing some notes when I realized the air inside the cabin smelled different. It was sour and damp, like turned soil. I checked around for leaks, but everything looked the same. When I stepped outside, the moon was half covered by clouds, and the graveyard stretched out in a dim, uneven gray. I stood there for a while, watching the mist curl around the stones. Then, from somewhere near the middle row, I heard a dull thud, like someone stepping heavily into mud. I froze, listening. It came again, slower this time, followed by a faint scraping sound. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog, but the sound wasn't random. It moved in steady intervals, one slow step at a time. I wanted to call out, but I didn't. I just stood there until the sound stopped. The graveyard was silent again, but something about it felt wrong, like the whole field was holding its breath. I went back inside and bolted the door, even though I knew no one ever came here. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I went to check the area where I'd heard the noise. The ground was soft, and sure enough, there were footprints. But they weren't from boots or animal paws, they were bare, human. The prints went from one of the older graves to about 10 feet away, then disappeared into the grass. The dirt inside the footprints was darker and wet, as if whoever made them had stepped straight out of the ground. I stared at them for a long time, trying to reason it out. Maybe kids were playing some prank, but this place was miles from any neighborhood, and no one ever came this far into the woods. That day, I barely ate. I kept replaying the sounds from the night before. The wind blew harder that evening, rattling the window shutters. I stuffed rags in the cracks of the door and sat by the stove, reading through old caretaker logs I had found in the cabin. They were from the 1940s and listed basic maintenance: fence repairs, burials, headstone cleaning, but one note caught my attention. It mentioned how the ground near the back row wouldn't settle right, and how something kept disturbing the soil after rain. The handwriting was shaky, almost as if the man had been nervous writing it. I didn't know what to think. Later that night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint noise again, soft at first, then clearer. It came from behind the cabin, slow scraping, like someone dragging something heavy through dirt. I got up and held the lantern near the window. The glass was fogged and dirty, but I could see faint movement near the back fence. A shape, maybe human, hunched low to the ground, moving in short jerks. I stood frozen, staring, the light trembling in my hand. The figure paused, then straightened up slightly, as if it sensed the light. I could make out what looked like pale skin or maybe mud-covered flesh, but it was too dark to see clearly. Then it lowered again and crawled toward the tree line. I didn't follow. I waited until sunrise before stepping outside. The ground near the back fence was torn up, as if something had been digging. The dirt was scattered in clumps, and there was a deep groove leading from the fence toward the woods. I followed it halfway before stopping. The track led straight to the creek. There, at the muddy edge, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A tattered piece of fabric, maybe from an old burial cloth, half buried in mud. I picked it up and dropped it immediately. It was soaked, and the smell that came off it was like rot mixed with stagnant water. That day, I packed up my things. I told myself I'd had enough of the place, that I'd finish my work back in town. But before I left, I noticed something else. Near the grave where the footprints had started, the dirt was freshly turned again. The marker had fallen over, and part of the ground looked sunken in, as if it had caved slightly. I didn't touch it. I just looked at it for a while, then turned and walked back to the cabin to grab the last of my gear. As I was leaving, I glanced back one last time. The morning light fell across the graveyard, soft and pale. It almost looked peaceful again. But when I reached the edge of the path that led into the woods, I noticed movement at the far end of the field, right near that same grave. The soil shifted slightly, like something underneath was pushing upward, just once. Then it stopped. I didn't wait to see more. I left the cabin locked and reported to the town that the place needed to be condemned. A few months later, they fenced it off completely. No one went near it after that. Years passed, but sometimes when I drive near Millhaven, I take the back road that passes by the old cemetery hill. You can still see the top of the fence through the trees, and in winter when the leaves fall, the outline of the cabin is faintly visible behind it, tilted, sinking slowly into the ground. Every time I look at it, I feel the same tightness in my chest. I know what I saw wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't my imagination. The earth there was soft, too soft, like it never settled right, and whatever had been buried in that graveyard had a way of coming back to the surface, piece by piece, when the ground got wet enough. It's been 30 years since that week, and I still think about the sound, the slow, dragging scrape that woke me that night. I know it was real because even now, when it rains hard enough and the air smells of wet soil, I can almost hear it again. Not loud, not close, just faint and steady, like something heavy moving under the ground, trying to find its way up. It was late autumn of 2014 when I decided to take care of my uncle's old farm for a few weeks. He had moved to a retirement home after his health got worse, and the place had been sitting empty for nearly a year. The farm was in a quiet area outside a small town called Franklin, about 40 miles from any main road in rural Ohio. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and at night, the silence there was so deep that even the sound of crickets carried far across the empty fields. I was 31 at the time, and I had been between jobs, so it felt like something useful to do. Keeping the property maintained, checking on the livestock, and making sure no one broke in. I brought my dog, a mixed breed named Cooper, who was always alert and never afraid of anything. I thought having him around would make the long nights less lonely. The farmhouse sat near the edge of a long dirt road that ended at a wide patch of dead cornfields. The house itself was old but sturdy, with peeling white paint and green shutters that creaked whenever the wind picked up. About 50 yards from it stood a smaller cabin, more like a shed, that my uncle used to store tools and equipment. Behind that, the land sloped down into a patch of woods that looked endless when the fog rolled in. The first few days went fine. I'd wake up early, feed the few chickens that remained, check the barn, and clear fallen branches from the yard. During the day, the farm felt peaceful. The sun hit the old barn roof just right, and I'd sit on the porch with Cooper, drinking coffee while watching the field sway in the wind. But as soon as the sun dipped behind the trees, the place changed. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful anymore. It was too still, like the land itself was holding its breath. The first strange thing I noticed happened on the fourth night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside the farmhouse. Slow, heavy steps moving around the porch. Cooper was growling softly beside the bed, ears pinned forward. I stayed still, thinking maybe it was a stray animal or the wind knocking something loose. The boards outside creaked again, this time closer to the door. I reached for the flashlight, and just as I clicked it on, the sound stopped completely. I stayed awake until dawn, listening. When the sun came up, I checked outside. The porch was empty, but there were muddy footprints near the steps. They were too big to be mine, long and uneven, like whoever made them was dragging one leg. They led off toward the direction of the cabin behind the house. I walked over there with Cooper trotting beside me, sniffing the ground. The cabin door was open just a crack, and the lock had been broken. Inside, everything was still there. The rusted tools, old rakes, a chainsaw on the bench, but I noticed something strange. On the far wall, above the work table, there were fresh claw marks. Not deep enough to be made by a bear, but long, like someone had dragged a sharp tool across the wood. That day, I tried not to think about it much. I fixed the lock on the cabin, cleaned the porch, and made sure the back doors were secure. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever I went near the tree line, I'd catch glimpses of movement between the trunks. Something pale and quick, always just out of sight. I told myself it was probably deer or coyotes, but the way Cooper would stop and stare into the trees with his hair standing up didn't make that easy to believe. The next few nights were worse. The noises came back. Sometimes it was faint scratching on the walls. Other times it sounded like something dragging across the ground outside. Once, just before midnight, I heard what sounded like someone breathing under the floorboards. It was faint and slow, but it was there. I checked the basement the next morning, but there was nothing, just dust, cobwebs, and old storage boxes that hadn't been opened in years. By the end of the first week, I started keeping the lights on through the night. I hardly slept. Cooper had stopped sleeping too. He'd stand by the window for hours, watching the yard, growling under his breath. The air inside the farmhouse felt different, thicker somehow, like it carried a heaviness I couldn't explain. One afternoon, I drove into town to get more supplies. I mentioned to the clerk at the hardware store that I'd been staying at my uncle's place. His expression changed when I said the location. He didn't say anything, but he looked at me for a moment like he wanted to tell me something and then stopped himself. I didn't press. That evening, the sky turned dark earlier than usual, and the wind started to pick up. I sat by the window, watching the fields move like waves under the moonlight. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The house went completely black except for the faint light of my flashlight. Cooper started barking, loud and sharp, facing the front door. I froze. The footsteps were back, slow and steady, coming up the porch again. I could feel each creak of the boards through the floor. I waited, holding the flashlight tight, staring at the door. The handle twitched slightly, then stopped. Cooper's barking turned into a low growl. I didn't move, after what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes. The footsteps faded. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening to the wind scrape against the windows. When morning came, I found more footprints in the mud, circling the farmhouse. They went all the way around, looping near the windows and then off toward the field. I followed them as far as I could. They ended about 50 feet from the edge of the woods, where the grass had been flattened in a long, narrow shape, as if someone had been lying there watching the house. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, threw everything into the truck, and went back inside to grab Cooper's leash. But he wasn't in the house. I called his name, checked every room, then ran outside. The yard was empty. I called again and again, but there was only silence. The only sound I could hear was the wind moving through the corn stalks behind the cabin. I walked toward the cabin, flashlight shaking in my hand. The door was open again, swinging slowly back and forth. I stepped inside. Everything looked the same at first, until I noticed the floor near the corner. There were smudges of mud, and beside them, paw prints. Cooper's paw prints. They led to a trapdoor I'd never noticed before, half hidden under an old rug. I pulled the rug aside and lifted the trapdoor. A cold smell came up from below, wet dirt and decay. I shined the light down and saw a narrow passage dug into the ground, leading into darkness. The paw prints stopped right at the edge. I called his name once more, but there was no sound. I didn't go down. Couldn't. I shut the trapdoor, locked the cabin again, and left that farm behind. I drove straight into town, shaking so badly I could hardly hold the wheel. I stayed in a motel for 2 nights before going back to my apartment in the city. A few days later, I called the sheriff's office and told them everything. They went out there to check, but they said they didn't find any signs of trespassing. The cabin was locked, the field was untouched, and there were no footprints anywhere. They didn't find Cooper either. It's been years now, and I still think about that place more often than I want to. I've tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was an animal, maybe someone had been hiding on the property. But none of it explains the footsteps, the breathing, or why the ground behind the cabin looked like someone had been lying there night after night, watching me. I've never gone back. My uncle's farm was sold a year later. The new owners tore down the cabin completely. I drove past the area once last summer, just out of curiosity. The field was overgrown again, the land quiet and still. But when I stopped the truck and looked out across the grass, I thought I saw something move near where the cabin used to stand. Just a quick shift of shape, pale against the darker green. I didn't get out to check. I started the truck and kept driving until the farm disappeared from my rearview mirror, and I haven't gone near Franklin since. It was late October 1998 when I decided to drive out to an old hunting cabin my uncle had left behind in northern Montana. He'd passed away years ago, and nobody in the family had been there since. I was 37 then, tired from work, trying to get away from everything for a few quiet days. The drive took nearly 9 hours from Billings, through winding roads, flat stretches of prairie, and long, lonely pine forests that seemed to go on forever. I remember the air getting colder with every mile, the kind of cold that seeps into your hands even if you keep the heater on. The cabin sat about 2 miles off a dirt trail that barely counted as a road anymore. I had to park my truck at the base of a small hill and walk the rest of the way. The ground was soft from recent rain, my boots sinking slightly with every step. Fallen leaves were scattered everywhere, brown, orange, half-rotted. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood exactly like I remembered it from childhood visits. Small, one-story, built from rough timber, a rusted metal roof bent near one corner. The windows were covered in grime. The porch sagged in the middle. I unlocked the door using the old key that had been on my uncle's ring for decades. It stuck halfway in the lock before giving in with a hard twist. Inside, it was cold and stale. Dust covered every surface. The wooden floor creaked under my boots. A few dead insects lay scattered on the windowsills. A faded rug covered part of the living area. There was a small wood stove in the corner and a narrow cot against the wall. Everything felt still, like no one had breathed inside that place in years. I set my bag down, opened one of the windows to let the air change, and started cleaning. I wasn't scared, just uneasy. The kind of unease that comes from being too far away from everything familiar. I swept out cobwebs, wiped down the table, and gathered some dry firewood from a pile outside. The woods around the cabin were dense, thick with pine and birch. The silence there wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like sound didn't travel right. That first night, I sat by the small fire and listened. The wind pushed through the trees outside, low and constant. Every once in a while, I'd hear a crack or a shuffle from the woods, probably just a deer or raccoon. But there was one sound I couldn't place. It was faint, like the crunch of boots stepping carefully through the brush. It would stop for long stretches, then start again closer or farther. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal circling. Still, I barely slept. The next morning was cold and gray. I went down to the stream a few hundred feet from the cabin to fill a bucket with water. The path was covered in wet leaves, and I noticed something odd near the edge. Deep footprints, not mine, pressed into the mud. They looked fresh, the shape clear and clean. Too big to be mine. My first thought was maybe some hunter had wandered through. But there were no tire tracks, no ATV marks near the trail where I'd parked. Whoever it was, they'd come through the forest on foot. The day went by quietly. I spent it chopping wood and trying to make the cabin a bit more livable. Around dusk, I found an old map of the area in one of the drawers, yellowed and torn. It showed miles of empty forest, an old logging road, and a small mark labeled Ranger Station, closed. The station was about 2 miles north. I figured I'd walk up there the next day just to see if it was still standing. Maybe I could find some supplies. That night, the sounds started again. Around midnight, I heard it. Slow, steady footsteps in the leaves outside. Not close at first, but circling. The fire inside the stove had burned low, and I could see faint light flickering across the walls. I stayed still on the cot, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft scrape along the porch. Not an animal this time. Too deliberate. My throat went dry. I reached for the small hatchet I kept near the stove. The noise didn't come again, and after an hour or so, I finally forced myself to lie back down. Sleep came in short, broken pieces. When morning came, I opened the front door. The porch boards had new marks, mud streaks, a single heel print, faint but there. Whoever had been there stood right at the door at some point. I scanned the woods, but everything looked still. I walked a few yards out, trying to trace where the prints led, but the ground was too uneven. They disappeared into the trees. I left for the old ranger station that afternoon, carrying a flashlight and some food. The trail was rough, the trees crowding in so tight that the light faded even though it was midday. After about an hour, I reached what was left of the building. It was mostly collapsed, half the roof gone, vines growing up through the walls. Inside, there were old shelves, some papers eaten by damp, and a few rusted tools. But what caught my attention was a torn sleeping bag near the corner, and beside it, a metal cup that looked recently used. The inside was clean, and the ground near it had fresh ash. like someone had made a small fire there not long ago. I didn't stay long. The feeling of being watched came back strong. On the walk back, I kept glancing behind me. Once, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a quick flicker of brown or gray, but it was gone before I could focus. When I reached the cabin again, the sun was setting. The woods were dead quiet. I bolted the door and kept the hatchet close. Around 10 p.m., I heard something again, this time sharper. A metallic clink. It sounded like someone trying the handle of my truck outside. My heart started pounding. I moved to the window and peered out through a crack in the grime. The truck sat there in the clearing, dim under the weak moonlight. The driver's door was open. I could barely see a shape moving near it, bending down. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, the shape stood, turned toward the cabin, and froze. I couldn't see a face, just a dark figure, standing perfectly still in the cold. Then it stepped backward, slow and quiet, until it blended into the trees. The rest of that night felt endless. Every creak of the wood made my skin crawl. I barely blinked, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When morning finally came, I stepped outside. The ground around my truck had more footprints, same as before, deep and clear. The gas cap was open, and one of the back tires looked deflated, like it had been cut. That's when it hit me. Whoever it was didn't want me leaving easily. I gathered my things in a hurry. I threw my bag in the truck, checked under the seats, and kept my hatchet near the gearshift. The tire was damaged, but not flat enough to stop me. I drove fast down that dirt path, the steering wheel shaking from the rough ground. When I hit the main road, I didn't stop. I drove until I reached a small gas station nearly 30 miles away. The attendant stared when I pulled in. Mud splattered everywhere. The side of my truck scratched from branches. He pointed out that one of my tires was leaking air fast. I didn't tell him what happened. I just asked him to replace it and kept watching the road behind me. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I got a letter from a local sheriff's office saying someone had reported squatters in the woods near that area. They'd found traces of an old camp about a mile from my uncle's place. Empty cans, fire pits, even some torn clothes. They never caught anyone. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I hear something outside my house late at night. I remember how quiet those woods were, how the air didn't carry sound right. I used to think the forest was peaceful. Now I know it's just indifferent. When you're alone out there, miles from anyone, the line between safe and hunted gets thin fast. Every time I think about it, I see that figure again. Still as stone, standing in the dark, waiting. And I can't help but wonder how long they'd been watching before I even knew they were there. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the northern woods of Montana. I had been working long hours in construction, and I needed a break, somewhere quiet, far from the noise of the city. I rented an old cabin that used to belong to a retired trapper. It sat on a slope facing a small frozen lake, about 12 miles from the nearest road. I brought my dog, a German shepherd named Duke. He was my closest companion, always alert and protective. The drive up was rough. Thick pine forests swallowed the dirt road, and the late afternoon sky had already turned gray with heavy clouds. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked even older than the pictures I'd seen online. The logs were dark from years of rain and wind. The porch leaned a little, and the windows had smudges of dust thick enough to blur the view inside. Still, it felt solid. A good place to be alone for a while. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that stung your nose when you breathed. I unloaded my truck. Food, a few tools, some firewood, and my shotgun. Not because I expected trouble, but because it felt wrong to be out here without one. Duke ran around, nose to the ground, tail up, sniffing every inch of the clearing. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry wood, old dust, and a faint trace of smoke from whoever had last used the fireplace. There were 2 rooms, one main area with the stove and a small table, and a narrow bedroom in the back with a single bed. The floor creaked with every step. I got the fire going, cooked some canned beans, and fed Duke. By nightfall, the wind had started howling through the trees, and I could hear the lake ice shifting and cracking. The first 2 nights were peaceful. I spent the days hiking around, cutting wood, and sitting by the fire with Duke curled at my feet. But on the 3rd night, something changed. Started around midnight. I was half asleep when Duke lifted his head and growled, deep and low. I turned on my side and listened. The cabin was silent except for the fire popping. I figured it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but Duke didn't stop. He got up and stood by the door, ears forward, growling under his breath. I sat up and listened harder. Then I heard it, something moving outside. Slow steps in the snow, crunching close to the porch. I stayed quiet, every muscle tight. The steps stopped. I waited for a knock or maybe the sound of something brushing against the wall. But there was nothing, just silence. After a minute, Duke let out a short bark, sharp and loud, and the sound outside stopped completely. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, Duke settled back down, though he kept his head up, watching the door until the fire went out. In the morning, I found footprints in the snow, too large to be mine and too heavy to belong to an animal. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin once, and stopped by the side window. Then they went back into the woods. I stood there staring at them, my breath fogging in the cold air. They weren't fresh, maybe from the night before, but the thought of someone walking out here in the middle of the night, miles from anywhere, didn't sit right. I walked the tree line for a while, but found nothing except more snow and silence. That day, I kept Duke close. I didn't go far from the cabin. I carried the shotgun even when I chopped firewood. Every so often, I felt eyes on me, like something was watching from the woods. I told myself it was just my imagination, but Duke kept glancing toward the trees too. By the time the sun went down, the temperature had dropped hard. The air felt heavier, like the sky itself was pressing down. I locked the door, loaded the shotgun, and sat by the fire again. I tried to read, but couldn't focus. Duke lay in front of the door, not sleeping, just listening. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching, faint but real, along the back wall. Duke jumped up, barking wildly. I grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun, heart pounding, and moved toward the sound. It stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then it started again, lower this time, like something dragging across the outer wall. I didn't open the door. I went to the window and shined the light outside, but the beam only reached a few feet before the dark swallowed it. Nothing moved. Duke growled until his throat went hoarse. The scratching stopped after a minute, replaced by that same heavy silence from the night before. I didn't sleep again. I sat up till dawn, staring at the door. When daylight came, I went out to look. Behind the cabin, the snow was disturbed. The same footprints again, only this time there were more, circling tighter, as if whoever it was had walked around for a while. Near the wall, I saw marks in the wood, like someone had run a knife or metal tool across it. The thought of someone standing there, dragging something along the wall while I was just feet away inside, made my stomach turn. I didn't know whether to pack up and leave or stay until morning. The road was long and rough, and my truck wasn't built for snow that deep. I decided to stay one more night, but I boarded up the windows from the inside with spare wood planks and kept the shotgun loaded beside me. That evening, the wind was brutal. It screamed through the trees, carrying loose snow that rattled against the walls. Duke wouldn't stop pacing. Every few minutes he'd stop, ears perked, looking toward the back door. Then came a thud, heavy, solid, like something had hit the side of the cabin. Duke barked and ran toward it. I followed, flashlight shaking in my hand. Another thud came, closer this time, followed by slow footsteps moving along the wall toward the door. I stood there, waiting for whoever it was to try the handle. But they didn't. Instead, I heard something drag across the porch. A boot, maybe, and then a pause. Duke was losing his mind, barking so loud it echoed off the walls. I aimed the flashlight at the window, but the planks blocked most of the view. Then, through one small gap, I saw movement. Just a glimpse. A shoulder, a sleeve, something dark slipping past the edge of the porch. That was enough. I grabbed my coat, my bag, and the keys. I opened the front door fast, shotgun in one hand, flashlight in the other. The beam cut through the snow, but nothing was there. Just prints, fresh, deep, leading back toward the trees. I didn't care what it was anymore. I called Duke, loaded him into the truck, and drove off as fast as the snow let me. The road was rough, my tires sliding, the headlights bouncing through the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. It took almost 2 hours to reach the main road. I stopped once, just to catch my breath, and looked back. The woods were dark and still. Duke sat beside me, quiet now, watching the same way I was. When I got home, I reported it to the local sheriff. He said sometimes squatters or hunters wander too close to private cabins. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe. But what bothered me most wasn't the footprints or the marks. It was that they never found any sign of another person out there. No camp, no gear, no vehicle tracks. Just those footprints circling the cabin and vanishing into the trees. I never went back. The cabin's still up there, I'm sure, half buried in snow. But sometimes when I take Duke out for a walk late at night and the wind moves through the trees just right, I can almost hear that faint dragging sound again, the same slow scrape against wood, and it reminds me of how small I felt out there, alone in the dark, not knowing who or what was watching. And I've learned since then, silence isn't peace in the woods. Sometimes, silence is the sound of something waiting. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a long trip alone into the Amazon rainforest. I had been working as an environmental researcher for nearly 10 years, most of it behind computer screens and lab equipment. I wanted to get away from that, to see the real thing untouched and raw. A colleague of mine had told me about an old wooden cabin left behind by a group of researchers in the late 90s, far from any known trail, somewhere along a branch of the Tapajos River. He said it was mostly forgotten, half swallowed by the forest, but still standing. That was all I needed to hear. I packed light, just the essentials. A machete, a tent, a small generator, and some supplies that I figured would last about 3 weeks. The trip started out as something peaceful. I took a small boat down the river, following coordinates I had printed out from old survey maps. The jungle was thick but alive in a way I had never seen before, every inch of it pulsing with noise. Birds, insects, frogs, things splashing in the water I couldn't see. At night, the air was heavy and wet, filled with sounds that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The humidity soaked into my clothes, my skin, my food. Even the paper in my notebooks curled at the edges. After 3 days, I found the cabin. It was smaller than I had expected, almost hidden behind vines and tall ferns. The wood was dark and soft with age, some of it eaten away by termites. The roof was made of rusted corrugated metal, and half of it had caved in on one side. The front steps were gone completely, so I had to climb up on a log to get inside. The air inside the cabin was stale and thick, with a faint, sour smell of mold and something else, like old oil or wet leather. A single metal bed frame sat against the wall, no mattress, just the frame and a few broken springs. There were some shelves still nailed to the walls with glass jars filled with murky liquids and dead insects, labels too faded to read. I set up my things and decided to clean out a corner to sleep in. At night, the jungle never really went quiet. There was a constant buzz and rhythm that felt almost like breathing. I got used to it after the first few nights, but what I didn't get used to were the sudden silences. Every now and then, for no reason I could find, everything would stop. The insects, the frogs, even the leaves. Those silences never lasted long. Maybe 30 seconds, sometimes a minute, but they felt longer. I would lie there, flashlight in my hand, just staring at the ceiling, waiting for the noise to come back. Around the fifth night, I started hearing something different. It wasn't the usual animal sounds. It was heavier, slow, deliberate footsteps outside the cabin. The kind of sound that didn't fit in with the rest of the forest. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a tapir, maybe even a jaguar. I stayed still, gripping the flashlight, not breathing. The steps would come close, stop, and then nothing. I waited for the noise again, but it never came until the next night. The next day, I looked for tracks around the cabin. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain, so footprints should have been easy to spot. But I didn't find anything, just the usual mess of leaves, roots, and bugs. I convinced myself it was all in my head, probably the sound of water dripping on leaves or the shifting wood of the cabin. But something in me didn't believe that. One afternoon, while clearing some vines off the side of the cabin, I found something strange. Behind one of the walls, hidden by overgrown ferns, there was a small shed made from the same type of wood as the cabin. The door was sealed with a rusted chain, but the wood was soft enough that I could pry it open with my machete. Inside were several large plastic drums, some split open, and piles of rotted burlap sacks. The smell hit me first, a mix of decay and chemicals. When I shined my flashlight inside one of the open drums, I saw something that looked like old, blackened meat. It took me a few seconds to realize they were animal parts. Bones, feathers, even what looked like the head of a monkey, all soaked in a thick, dark sludge. I stepped back and almost slipped on the wet ground. My stomach turned. Whatever the people who lived here were doing, it wasn't research anymore. I closed the door, pushed it shut with a stick, and didn't go near it again that day. That night, the footsteps came again, but this time they were louder. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, circling it, stopping every few steps. I lay on the floor, not moving, the beam of my flashlight pointing at the ceiling. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves just outside the wall beside my head. Then it stopped again. I waited, my hand tight around the machete. The silence went on for a long time. Then I heard a single sound, the soft creak of the front step. Someone or something was testing the boards. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I checked outside again, but like before, there were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. The jungle looked untouched. That bothered me more than anything. By the second week, my food was running low, and I started thinking about leaving early. The air in the cabin felt heavier every day, and the smell from that shed seemed to seep through the cracks. One evening, while trying to pack up, I noticed something strange on the inside of the door. Scratched into the wood were lines, not deep, but carved by hand or maybe with a knife. They looked like tallies, groups of 5 going all the way down to the floor. I counted them. There were 63. I didn't know what to make of it, but they looked old. Some of the lines were faded, some fresh. I tried to ignore it and went to sleep that night with my bag ready by my side. Started raining just after midnight. Heavy, steady rain that beat on the roof like stones. I could barely hear anything over the sound of it, but after a while, I felt something off. There was movement, not outside this time, but inside the cabin. It was faint at first, like the slow shifting of weight on wood. I turned on my flashlight, my heart pounding. The beam caught something at the far end of the room near the old shelves. A small puddle spreading across the floor, black and thick, not water. The smell was unbearable, like rot and metal. I stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath me, and I saw where it was coming from. The wall near the shed. The wood was dark, soaked through, and something was leaking from the other side. That was it for me. I grabbed my bag, my machete, and my map, and I left. I didn't care about the rain, the dark, or the fact that I was miles from the river. I just walked. The forest was dense, the mud deep. Every sound behind me felt too close. I walked until morning, then another full day without stopping until I finally reached the river. My small boat was still tied up where I'd left it, half filled with rainwater. I got in, started the engine, and didn't look back. When I got back to the small outpost town 3 days later, I went straight to the local ranger station. I told them what I found, or at least most of it. They took notes, said they'd send someone to check, but I could tell they didn't believe much of it. Months later, I received an email from one of the rangers I had met there. He said they found the cabin, but not the shed. The whole structure had collapsed after a heavy storm, buried under mud and vines. They didn't find any plastic drums or bones, only old research equipment, papers, and animal traps. I never went back to the Amazon after that. I still think about those 63 tally marks sometimes, what they meant, who made them, and if there were more somewhere I didn't see. I still don't know what was in that shed or what was walking around the cabin those nights. But I know what I felt there, the weight of something human, something that wasn't supposed to be part of the jungle but had become part of it anyway. And that feeling never left me. Even now, years later, every time it rains hard enough to drown out the sound of everything else, I still find myself waiting for that silence. That moment when the world stops breathing, just before the footsteps start again. It was late September of 2011 when I got assigned to a remote ranger outpost deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho. I was 34 then, with a few years of backcountry work under my belt, but this was the first time I'd be stationed completely alone for an extended period. The cabin was known as Dry Creek Station, a small log structure built in the 1970s, sitting about 20 miles from the nearest paved road. The last ranger to use it had been there 3 years earlier. From what I was told, it hadn't been properly maintained since. I drove up in a parked truck, the last stretch being a washed-out dirt road that climbed through narrow switchbacks lined with pines and spruces. The air smelled like cold sap and wet soil. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, and everything had that orange tint that fades quick in the mountains. The cabin looked smaller than I expected, about the size of a single-car garage. Its roof was tin, dented in a few spots, and moss crept up the back wall. The porch sagged a little, and the front door had a single window covered in old fly tape. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, with a smell like wet wood and something metallic underneath. Dust coated everything, the bunk bed, the desk, even the small propane stove. A few mouse droppings scattered across the counter near a rusted coffee pot. There was an old map pinned on the wall, corners curled, showing ranger districts from before the boundaries changed. In one corner sat a metal filing cabinet, locked with a bent latch. I remember setting my gear down and standing in the middle of the cabin, trying to picture the months ahead. My assignment was to monitor fire conditions, check trail cameras, and occasionally radio in about wildlife sightings. Nothing complicated, but isolation always has a way of wearing on people. I didn't think much of it then. That first night, the quiet hit hard. You don't realize how constant background noise is. Cars, voices, electric hum, until it's gone. Out there, it was only wind and forest. When it got dark, it got completely dark. The kind of black where even your own hands disappear. I used a small lantern that gave off a weak yellow light. The generator was dead, and the backup battery barely held charge. For the first few days, I settled into a routine. I'd wake up early, hike out to check the camera traps, record water levels in the nearby creek, and log everything before sunset. I'd hear the occasional elk call or a distant coyote at night, but otherwise it was uneventful. The kind of peaceful that feels almost artificial. Then, about a week in, I noticed something strange. While checking the trail cameras, one of them, set about 6 miles east, was missing. The straps that held it to the tree were cut clean through, not torn. I assumed maybe a bear got curious and pulled it down, though the cut looked too sharp. I marked it in my report, thinking little of it, and went back to the cabin. 2 days later, another camera was gone. Same deal. Cleanly removed, no damage to the tree, no signs of wildlife around it. I figured maybe a hunter was tampering with them, though the area was closed off and far too deep for anyone to just wander into. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the cot listening to the wind scrape against the cabin walls. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like light footsteps on the gravel outside. I froze. The nearest person was over 20 miles away. My first thought was maybe an animal, a deer or maybe a stray dog, but the steps were too slow. They circled the cabin once, then stopped near the porch. I didn't move or make a sound. After a while, there was nothing, just silence. The next morning, I found fresh prints in the dirt near the steps. They weren't boots, bare feet, adult-sized. I stared at them for a long time, trying to reason it out. Maybe a hiker got lost, but who hikes barefoot that far into the backcountry? The prints led toward the tree line and vanished in the thick brush. I wrote a report and planned to radio it in that evening, but the radio wasn't working. The antenna wire had been disconnected, cleanly cut again. I reconnected it, but the signal was weak, only static. That was when I started to feel uneasy, like someone else was out there, watching. For the next few days, I kept busy during daylight. I checked the perimeter, made sure the food supply was sealed tight, and moved the lantern closer to the bed at night. Sleep became harder. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard movement outside. The crunch of leaves, the faint sound of something brushing against the wall. On the 5th night, I woke up to a noise inside the cabin. A faint creak, like weight shifting on the floorboards. I sat up, holding my flashlight, and scanned the room. The door was still locked. Everything looked the same, but the window near the stove was open a few inches. I was sure I'd shut it before bed. Cold air slipped through, and the curtain fluttered slightly. I got up slowly, closed it tight, and checked every inch of the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed, though one thing did catch my eye. The filing cabinet's latch was bent back, like it had been forced open. I hadn't touched it since I got there. Inside were old reports, most of them routine, but one folder stood out. It was labeled Incidents 1994 to 1998. Inside were a few handwritten notes. Each report described sightings of unauthorized individuals near the outpost, footprints, tampered equipment, missing supplies. The last one, dated 1998, mentioned a ranger who left before completing his post. The final line read, "No further contact after retrieval attempt." The next morning, I found one of my own camera traps hanging from a tree about 50 yards from the cabin. It was upside down, lens cracked. I checked the SD card anyway. Most of the photos were of trees and branches swaying in the wind, but the last image caught my eye. It showed the side of the cabin, taken at night. In the far edge of the frame, a figure stood by the window, barefoot, thin, facing directly toward the lens. That was enough. I decided to leave that day. I packed my bag, loaded it into the truck, and tried starting the engine. Nothing. The battery was dead. I checked under the hood. Someone had removed the terminals. Not corroded, not broken. Removed. Cleanly. I spent the rest of that day checking every possible way out. The radio was still down, the truck useless. I considered hiking out, but the trail was long and daylight was fading fast. I decided I'd leave first thing at dawn. That night was the longest of my life. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, listening. Every few minutes I'd hear something outside, branches breaking, faint breathing near the wall, sometimes the sound of footsteps circling the cabin again. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the doorknob rattle gently. I sat frozen, staring at it. It didn't open, but the sound of slow, steady breathing on the other side made my stomach twist. After a minute, it stopped. When the first light came, I grabbed my gear and left on foot. I didn't even bother locking up. The trail felt endless. I kept checking over my shoulder, sure I was being followed. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station 15 miles down the valley. When I reported everything, the supervisor said they'd send someone to check the cabin. A week later, I got a call saying the cabin was secure, nothing found. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, no missing equipment. They even said the truck started on the first try. I didn't go back. Months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked another ranger if they'd ever had trouble at Dry Creek Station. He shrugged and said no one had been assigned there since. Too remote, he said, not worth maintaining. But I'll never forget those bare footprints in the dirt, or the sound of breathing just beyond that thin wooden door. Out there, where no one should have been, something was watching. And it wasn't supernatural, it was human. That's what makes it worse. Every so often I think about that last night, how whoever it was had every chance to come inside but didn't. They just watched, waited, like they were comfortable there. Maybe they'd been living in those woods long before I ever arrived. Maybe they still are. That's the part that stays with me, knowing that sometimes, in those empty stretches of wilderness, you're not as alone as you think you are. It was the winter of 2014 when I decided to spend a few weeks in a rented cabin on the edge of Northumberland National Park in northern England. I was 38 back then, tired of my job in the city, and wanted to get away from everything. The cabin wasn't modern or cozy like the ones people post online. It was an old wooden structure, standing alone about half a mile off a narrow gravel road. The nearest village was over 10 miles away. The owner, an old man I met briefly before he handed me the keys, warned me that the place was quiet, too quiet for most. I didn't think much of it. I wanted quiet. The cabin sat at the end of a long dirt path lined with skeletal trees. The ground was frozen solid, and the grass around the cabin was brittle, snapping under my boots. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A mix of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust. Inside, everything looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Dust clung to the wooden beams, and the floorboards groaned with every step. There was no electricity, just a small generator out back and a wood stove that smoked if I fed it too much at once. I unpacked my bags, lit a few candles, and tried to settle in. The first 2 nights passed quietly. I spent my time chopping wood, cooking simple meals, and writing in a notebook I'd brought along. The silence was thick, almost heavy, broken only by the wind pushing through the trees or the occasional creak of the cabin's old frame. But on the 3rd night, I started to notice something strange. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps crunching over the frozen ground. They stopped just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a fox or a deer, but the sound was too heavy, too slow, like boots pressing into the ground. I held still, sitting near the stove, my breath barely moving. After a few moments, the sound faded away, and I convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I found footprints near the edge of the porch. They were human, small, maybe belonging to a woman. The prints were shallow, as if whoever made them had been walking carefully, almost tiptoeing. They led toward the tree line and disappeared. I tried to shake it off. People hike through these woods sometimes, I told myself. Maybe someone got lost. Still, I felt uneasy for the rest of the day. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin's walls creaked and shifted with the pressure, and the trees outside scraped against each other with dry, splintering sounds. Around 11, I looked out the small window near the bed. The moon was pale and thin, throwing weak light over the clearing. That's when I saw her. She was standing about 20 yards from the cabin, near the treeline. A woman, tall and thin, wearing something long and pale, like an old nightgown or dress. Her hair was dark and hung loose around her shoulders. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. I froze. My first thought was that maybe she needed help, maybe she was lost. But something about the way she stood there, not moving, not reacting to the cold or the wind, made me stay where I was. I watched her for several minutes. Then, without warning, she turned and walked into the trees. No rush, no stumbling, just calm, steady steps until the dark swallowed her up. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made my heart hammer. I kept the fire going, staring at the door, half expecting it to open on its own. When morning came, I stepped outside and walked to where I'd seen her. There were prints again, smaller than mine, pressed deep into the frosted earth. They led straight into the woods, the same direction I'd seen her go. I followed them for maybe 50 yards before they just stopped. No sign of a struggle, no broken branches, just gone. For the next few days, I didn't see her again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, when I was chopping wood or carrying water from the small stream nearby, I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, like someone's eyes were on me. Once, I caught sight of something pale between the trees, a flicker of movement, but when I looked closer, it was gone. One afternoon, I decided to check the generator behind the cabin. It had been sputtering lately, and I wanted to make sure it didn't die on me. When I got there, I noticed something strange. There were handprints on the metal casing. Small ones. They were faint, smudged, but they were definitely there. The surface was cold, and the prints looked recent, as if someone had touched it just hours before. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and a few pieces of wood. I kept a knife nearby, though I wasn't sure what good it would do if someone decided to break in. The wind howled harder than before, and the cabin shuddered with each gust. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, steady. I sat up, staring at the door, every muscle in my body tense. Then I heard something new, a light tapping on the window. It wasn't hard enough to break the glass, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails. I didn't move. I stared at the shadowed window for what felt like an hour. The tapping stopped, and the footsteps faded away again. When I finally looked outside, there was no one there, but I noticed the condensation on the window had smudges, finger marks, drawn through the thin layer of frost. By morning, I was exhausted.
Ide barely slept.
I decided I'd had enough and planned to leave that day. When I stepped outside to start packing my things into the car, I froze. On the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood, were marks, long, uneven lines, like someone had dragged something sharp across it. There were several of them, all in one place near the back door. I ran my fingers over them and felt splinters catch my skin. They weren't old. I left a few hours later, not even bothering to clean up. The dirt road felt endless as I drove back toward the main road. When I reached the village, I stopped at a small cafe for coffee before heading home. The owner, an older woman with a thick local accent, asked me where I'd been staying. When I mentioned the cabin, her expression changed slightly. She told me that years ago, a woman had gone missing in those woods. She'd lived alone in one of the old cabins, supposedly after her husband left her. They never found her body, but people said she used to walk the woods at night, even in the dead of winter, wearing her nightdress. I didn't respond. I didn't want to. I just nodded, finished my coffee, and left. That night, back home in my apartment in Newcastle, I tried to forget the whole thing. I told myself it was my imagination, that the isolation and the dark had gotten to me. But when I unpacked my bag, I found something that made my stomach turn. At the bottom, between my clothes, was a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. It wasn't mine. I opened it carefully. There was nothing written on it, just a small, dirty fingerprint pressed into the corner. I threw it away immediately, but that didn't stop the feeling that settled over me afterward. That strange, crawling awareness, like I'd brought something back with me. For weeks after, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard something faint in the hallway outside my flat. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The sleepless nights passed. Life went back to normal. But sometimes, especially when winter rolls around and the nights grow long and still, I catch myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see that same pale shape standing in the dark, waiting, just waiting, for me to notice her again. And every time I tell myself the same thing, that she was real, just a person, nothing more. But deep down, I know that some people disappear into the quiet places of the world and never truly leave them. They linger, not as ghosts, but as shadows in our memory, reminders of how easily a moment of curiosity can turn into something you'll never be able to explain or forget. It was late September of 2006 when I decided to take a short break from work and drive up to a small cabin I had bought a few years ago in northern Montana. I hadn't been there in almost 2 years, and the thought of quiet air, no phone signal, and a few nights alone seemed perfect. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 4 miles from the nearest dirt road. It was old, built sometime in the late 60s, but still held up well enough. It had no electricity, just a small wood stove, a hand pump for water, and an outhouse about 50 feet behind it. I packed enough supplies for 4 days, filled up my truck, and left before sunrise. By the time I reached the last dirt road, it was almost dark. The air was colder than I expected, and the forest looked heavier than I remembered. Thicker, darker, quieter. The trees leaned toward the narrow track, and my headlights caught patches of mist rising from the ground. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, took my backpack, a lantern, and the small cooler I'd packed, then started the half-hour walk through the woods to the cabin. The path was barely visible, covered with damp leaves and fallen branches. I could smell the wet earth, mixed with pine and the faint scent of something rotting nearby, probably a dead animal hidden somewhere in the brush. By the time I reached the cabin, night had fully taken over. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, but I was just relieved to see it still standing. The old wooden door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust floated in the air, caught by the beam of my lantern. The air inside was stale and cold. I set my things down on the small wooden table, brushed off the cobwebs that hung from the corners, and started a fire in the stove. Once the warmth started to fill the room, I unpacked some canned food and ate in silence, listening to the faint tapping of rain starting outside. It was peaceful at first, the kind of silence I had been craving. But after an hour or two, that silence began to feel heavy. It wasn't the kind of quiet that calms you. It was the kind that makes you aware of every single sound. Every pop of the wood, every scratch outside the wall, every creak of the old floor. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep right away. The rain was steady, but every now and then I heard something different. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but it sounded heavier, slower, more deliberate. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like something dragging across the wet leaves. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a loud thud outside. It was just before dawn. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath when I sat up. I waited a minute listening, but heard nothing else. I stepped outside with my flashlight. The rain had stopped, but everything was slick with dew. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. Behind the cabin, near the outhouse, I noticed something odd. The mud was disturbed, like something had been dragged across it. I crouched down and looked closer. It wasn't an animal. It was too wide for that, almost like someone had been pulling a tarp or a body. The trail led off into the trees and disappeared into the brush. I stood there for a long moment, feeling my stomach twist. I told myself it could have been from a fallen tree branch or something I just didn't understand right, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The mud was freshly disturbed, and I hadn't seen anyone in miles. I tried to shake it off, went back inside, and kept myself busy stacking firewood and cleaning. By afternoon, I tried to relax. I made coffee, sat by the small window, and wrote a few notes in the old notebook I kept there. The forest looked calm from inside. The light through the trees flickered softly as the wind moved through them. For a while, I managed to forget about the marks in the mud. But as the sun started to drop, I noticed something again. Something that didn't fit. Out past the tree line, maybe 30 yards away, there was a shape. It wasn't moving. I stared for a good minute before realizing it was a small pile of something dark. Branches, maybe. I ignored it for a while, but when I looked again later, it was gone. That night, I could barely eat. I felt uneasy, like the woods had eyes. I checked the door twice, made sure the lanterns were full, and sat awake for hours listening. Around midnight, it started again, that slow, dragging sound. It came from the left side of the cabin, near the small window by the stove. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again, closer. I sat still, my heart beating fast. There was no conversation, no light, nothing else. Just that steady movement, like someone pulling something heavy through the dirt. Then silence. I waited a long time before moving. When I finally stood up, I turned down the lantern so the light was low and looked through the window. Nothing, just darkness and trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the fire until morning. When daylight came, I went outside again. I didn't even need to look hard this time. The marks were back, clearer now. They circled part of the cabin, leading from the woods and stopping just beneath the window where I had heard the sound. The dirt there was disturbed deeply, like something heavy had rested there for a while. I followed the trail again, this time deeper into the woods. After about 50 yards, the ground began to rise slightly, and that's when I saw it. There, half buried under a layer of wet leaves and mud, was a tarp. A large blue tarp, torn in the middle. My stomach dropped. I hesitated, then pulled back the edge of it with a stick. Underneath were the remains of what looked like a human body. The clothes were rotting, but the shape was unmistakable. I didn't touch it. I backed away slowly, every sound of the forest growing sharper in my ears. The air felt wrong, too still. I ran back to the cabin and packed my things in a rush. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely tie the straps. It took me 10 minutes to grab everything, and I didn't even bother putting out the fire in the stove. I just wanted out. As I locked the door, I noticed something scratched into the wood of the doorframe. Faint, but fresh. It looked like letters carved roughly, maybe with a knife. It said, "Keep out." I didn't look back after that. I followed the trail to my truck, breathing hard, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. When I finally got to the road, I drove straight to the small town about an hour away and went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them what I found and where. They sent a deputy and some search crew out there that afternoon. 2 days later, one of the deputies called me. He said they found what I described. The body was real, a man likely dead for several months. No ID on him. The area around the cabin had signs that someone had been there recently, maybe using it to hide out. They found empty cans, a torn sleeping bag, and footprints around the back of the cabin that weren't mine. Whoever it was had been living near there for some time, maybe watching me the whole night. After that, I sold the cabin. I never went back. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the sound of that dragging in the dirt, the slow movement outside the wall, the heavy silence of the woods. I think about how close whoever it was must have been, just a few feet away from where I slept, waiting in the dark. I still can't sleep well when it rains. It had been raining for 3 days straight, the kind of steady, miserable rain that seeps into your bones and makes every movement feel heavier than it should. I was 31 at the time, living in northern Montana, somewhere between the pine ridges and the endless gray skies that hung over the valley. The rain had ruined my plans for the week. I had taken time off from work to finally start building a small cabin out on my uncle's old property, about 20 miles outside of town. He had left me the land when he moved south years ago. It wasn't much, just 5 acres of rough, uneven terrain, with a small clearing near the edge of a dense stretch of woods. No one had lived out there for decades. I thought it would be a good spot to put something of my own together. By the 3rd day of rain, I was tired of waiting. I loaded up my old Ford with lumber, tools, and supplies and decided to go anyway. The road was slick, lined with thick mud where the gravel gave up halfway to the property. My tires spun a few times, but I managed to make it. When I parked, the rain had settled into a fine drizzle, enough to blur the world but not enough to stop me from working. The air smelled of wet pine, earth, and something faintly metallic, like old rust. I started clearing the small patch where I planned to build. The grass was high and soaked, flattening under my boots with each step. The first few hours were simple work, measuring, marking the ground, setting the first corner posts. The rain made everything slower. My gloves were soaked through, my jeans clinging to my legs, but I kept going. I could hear nothing but the steady patter of rain and the dull thud of my hammer hitting the wood. By late afternoon, the light began to fade early, as it often does when the clouds are thick and low. The drizzle turned into heavier drops again, and I could feel the cold crawling up through the ground. I took a short break under the makeshift tarp I'd strung between 2 trees. The forest around me looked darker than it should have been. The rain had a way of muting color, and the trees seemed almost black against the gray sky. I remember noticing how still everything felt. No wind, no birds, no sound other than the constant tapping of rain on leaves and metal. When I went back to work, something felt different. Maybe it was just the fatigue setting in, or maybe it was how the air had changed, colder, sharper. I brushed it off and kept building. The cabin was only supposed to be small, 1 room about 10 by 10, enough to stay in for hunting trips or to just get away for a while. I had finished framing half the walls before I realized the rain was starting to turn to a misty fog that rolled in low across the clearing. It was thick, crawling along the ground like smoke. The trees disappeared into it one by one until I could barely see 20 feet ahead. I worked faster after that, though I couldn't explain why. There was a strange feeling creeping in, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Every time I stopped hammering, I'd hear something faint. Not quite footsteps, but the kind of sound that makes your brain tell you someone's nearby. I looked around more than once, scanning through the fog, trying to make sense of the shadows between the trees. But there was nothing. By evening, I decided to stop. The rain hadn't let up, and the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see the edge of the clearing anymore. My clothes were soaked through, and I could feel my skin prickling from the cold. I pulled out my small camping stove from the truck bed, heated a can of soup, and sat under the tarp, watching the rain ripple the puddles forming around the half-built cabin. The smell of wet wood mixed with the scent of propane and smoke. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. The fog moved differently in one spot near the treeline, not drifting like mist normally does, but rolling back and forth like something was walking through it. I tried to focus, squinting through the dim light, but the rain made it impossible to see clearly. The shape was tall, maybe a little too tall. For a second, I thought it might have been an elk or maybe even a man, but the way it moved didn't fit either. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself I was just tired. I had been out there since morning, working nonstop. I packed my tools, locked them in the truck bed, and unrolled my sleeping bag under the tarp. The sound of rain on plastic and canvas was almost calming. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. Every now and then, I'd hear the faintest sound. Twigs snapping, water sloshing, something brushing against the wet ground. I told myself it was just animals moving through the woods. Around midnight, the rain slowed again, and I opened my eyes to silence. Complete silence. No rain, no wind, nothing. Just still air and darkness thick enough that I could barely see the outline of my truck a few feet away. My flashlight beam barely cut through the fog, but I kept it close. The forest felt wrong. Even breathing sounded too loud. Then I caught it, a soft, dragging sound from behind the cabin frame. It was slow, like something heavy being pulled across the mud. My stomach tightened. I didn't move for a few seconds, just listened. Came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam bounced off the wet wood, the puddles, the edge of the trees, nothing. But the sound kept going, circling slowly, like something was moving just out of sight. I didn't want to believe it, but it sounded like someone walking in shallow mud. I stood up quietly, keeping the flashlight steady. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I moved toward the truck, careful not to make too much noise. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was so deep it made my ears ring. I waited. Then, out of the fog, I heard it again, one single step, deliberate, slow. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the fog. I couldn't see anything beyond the windshield, just a milky white haze that seemed to swallow the entire world. Every now and then, I'd see movement, faint, shapeless, but it never came close. I was too afraid to start the engine. I didn't want to draw attention. When morning finally came, the fog began to lift with the first pale light. I got out, soaked to the bone, and checked around the cabin site. There were tracks in the mud, not boot prints, not animal tracks either. They were too long, too wide, dragging in places like someone had been limping or crawling. They led from the trees to the edge of the cabin frame, then disappeared back into the woods. I packed everything up and left that morning. I didn't bother to finish the cabin. I never went back. A few weeks later, when I told my uncle about it, he said there used to be an old logging trail that ran through that land back in the 50s. A man went missing out there, one of the workers who got separated during a storm. They found some of his tools, but never him. I didn't believe in stories like that. Still don't. But I can't explain what I saw or what I heard that night. Every time it rains now, that heavy, cold kind of rain, I think about that clearing, about the half-built cabin standing alone in the fog. Sometimes I still see it in my head, unfinished, waiting for me to come back. But I never will. It was late November of 2016 when I drove up north into the Scottish Highlands, looking for a weekend of quiet and hunting. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, about a mile off a narrow road near Loch Laggan. I wanted to be alone. No distractions, no noise, Just the cold air, the forest, and my rifle. The cabin belonged to an old man who listed it on a small rental site. He mentioned it was used mostly by hunters and hikers. The pictures showed a single-room wooden cabin, a small wood stove, a cot, and a shed out back. It looked perfect for what I wanted. Isolation. The drive up there was rough. It started raining halfway, and the wind kept pushing against the car, bending the tall pines that lined the road. I reached the dirt path leading to the cabin just before dusk. The path was barely visible, full of mud and fallen leaves. My car tires slipped more than once before I saw the cabin appear through the trees. A small, dark shape with smoke coming faintly out of the metal chimney. It looked old but solid. When I stepped out, the first thing that hit me was the cold. It wasn't just chilly. It was the kind of cold that sank into your bones. The air smelled like wet wood and soil. The forest around was silent except for the wind brushing through the branches. I unlocked the cabin door. It stuck a little and pushed it open. The air inside was stale, mixed with the faint smell of old smoke and damp wood. There wasn't much inside. Just a single cot pushed against one wall, a small stove near the center, a rough wooden table, and a chair that looked handmade. The floor creaked under my boots. There were scratches all over the wood, some from boots, some from dragging things, maybe furniture. A single small window looked out toward the trees. I lit the lantern I brought and placed it on the table. The light flickered across the walls, showing marks where pictures or tools might have once hung. I started a small fire in the stove, using the logs stacked in a crate beside it. It took a while to get it going, but once it did, the heat started spreading slowly. I unpacked my things: rifle, ammo box, knife, a few tins of food, and my thermos. I was planning to stay for 3 nights. Outside, darkness settled fast. The rain stopped, but I could hear dripping from the trees and the faint rustle of something moving through the wet undergrowth. Probably a fox or deer. I sat inside for a while, warming my hands near the stove, trying to relax. Felt strange being that far from any town or house. My phone had no signal, and the nearest sign of civilization was the main road miles away. Later that night, I stepped outside with my flashlight to get some air. The forest was dense and silent. The moonlight came through thin clouds, casting pale light over everything. My breath came out in white clouds. That's when I noticed footprints in the mud near the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there yet. They were larger than mine, deep, and led toward the shed. At first, I thought it might have been the old man who owned the place, maybe checking on something before I arrived. But the prints looked fresh, too fresh. The rain had washed most of the ground clean earlier, and these stood out clearly, filled with shallow water. I followed them with my light. The shed was small, metal roof rusted, door slightly open. The hinges squeaked softly in the wind. I peeked inside, just old hunting gear, a broken chair, and a pile of split wood. Nothing strange. Still, the sight of those prints bothered me. I checked around the cabin again, shining the light through the trees, but everything looked normal. I went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to convince myself it was probably from an animal or someone passing by earlier in the day. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. The wood popping in the stove, the wind pressing against the roof, something light brushing the wall outside. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. The boards creaked faintly, one at a time. I lay still, barely breathing. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was dim. The steps stopped near the door. For a long time, there was nothing. Then a faint scrape, like something sliding across the porch wood. I waited, listening, heart pounding so loud it almost drowned the sound. After what felt like minutes, the noise faded. When daylight finally came, I got up and opened the door. The ground outside was wet again, and there were new footprints. This time, they stopped just short of the door, bigger than before, pressed deep into the mud. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. I looked around but saw no one. The forest was quiet. That day, I went out to hunt along the ridge about half a mile from the cabin. The air was crisp, and patches of snow clung to the shaded areas. I didn't see much, just a few rabbits and distant movement that might have been a stag. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped, I thought I heard faint crunching behind me, just out of sync with my steps. When I turned, there was nothing but trees. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. I was exhausted. The firewood I stacked the night before was scattered, like someone had kicked through it. The shed door was open again, swinging slowly. I checked inside. Everything was where it had been, but it still felt wrong. That night, I built the fire larger, locked the door again, and sat with the rifle beside me. As the hours passed, the wind grew stronger, and branches slapped against the roof. Around midnight, I heard the same slow creaking on the porch. This time, it was heavier. I aimed the flashlight at the window but saw only shadows moving across the glass. I didn't move. Then came a dull thump, like someone pressing their hand, or something heavier, against the door. The latch rattled slightly. I raised the rifle, safety off, and aimed at the door. My hands were shaking. After a few seconds, it stopped. The sound of footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I waited another hour before I dared to move. I barely slept again. When morning came, I packed everything fast. I stepped outside to load the car, and that's when I saw it. Near the edge of the trees, about 30 yards out, there was a small pile of bones. Animal bones, maybe deer, but arranged in a strange way, stacked neatly like someone had placed them deliberately. I checked around but saw no other sign of anyone. The footprints were gone, washed away by the early frost. I didn't stay to find out more. I drove off the muddy path, tires spinning, until I reached the main road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back near the lock where my phone finally got signal. Later that week, I looked up the area online out of curiosity. I found a local forum where a few hunters talked about the same woods. One man mentioned missing dogs. Another talked about hearing movement outside their tent at night. There were even a few notes about someone living illegally deep in those woods, a hermit or poacher who stole from cabins. It made sense then, the footprints, the noises, the bones. Someone had been living out there, watching. Maybe they used the old cabins for shelter when empty. Maybe they didn't like finding someone in one. Even now, when I think about that place, I can still picture those footprints in the mud, the way they stopped just short of the door. Whoever it was, they weren't passing by. They were watching, and I'm almost sure they waited for the light to go out before stepping closer. I haven't been back to the highlands since. The rifle stays locked in my closet, and every time I hear floorboards creak at night, it reminds me of that cold, wet silence outside that cabin. The feeling of being alone but not truly alone. It was the autumn of 2013 when I decided to take a break from city life and rent a small cabin in northern Arizona. I was 29 then, tired of the noise, and needed somewhere quiet to reset. I found the place online, a one-room wooden cabin sitting at the edge of a dried riverbed, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The pictures showed tall pines surrounding it, an old fire pit outside, and a small deck facing the valley. It looked peaceful, isolated, and exactly what I thought I needed. The road to the cabin was rough, nothing but dirt and rock. My old truck struggled the last 2 miles. I got there in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the ground. The cabin was smaller than I expected, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with chipped brown paint and a metal roof that looked newer than the rest of it. There was a shed a few feet away, its door slightly crooked, and a broken fence that ran along the edge of the woods. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. The floorboards creaked with every step, and I could hear the wind press against the windows. There was no phone signal, but I didn't care. I had canned food, bottled water, and enough supplies to last a couple of weeks. The first few days went by quietly. I spent my time hiking through the forest, reading, and sitting outside in the evenings with a small fire burning. The nights got cold fast out there, and by the second night, I started hearing things in the woods. Faint footsteps, branches snapping, and sometimes a long, low whistle that echoed far away. I told myself it was probably deer or coyotes. The area was known for both. One night, around midnight, I woke up to scratching sounds against the side of the cabin. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the wood. Then it grew louder, slow, dragging scratches that moved from one wall to the next. My dog, a black lab named Murphy, lifted his head and growled low from his spot at the foot of the bed. His hair stood up along his back. I grabbed my flashlight, but when I looked through the window, there was nothing, just the trees swaying slightly under the moonlight. I went outside the next morning and checked around the cabin. There were marks along the lower part of the wall, long, uneven scratches like something had dragged sharp rocks across the wood. I thought maybe a raccoon or even a bear had done it, but the height of the marks didn't make sense. They were too high off the ground and spaced too far apart. By the fourth night, I noticed something stranger. Murphy wouldn't go near the back of the cabin anymore. He'd stay close to the door, staring at the tree lean, his ears twitching. Around dusk, he started acting anxious, pacing and whining quietly. I tried to ignore it, but that night, I heard something again. Footsteps this time, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening to the crunch of leaves outside. They stopped near the window by my bed. I turned off my flashlight and waited. The sound of breathing came from outside, deep, uneven, human-like but slower, heavier. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. Murphy growled again, low and rumbling. I didn't move until the sound faded away into the woods. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt behind the cabin. They were long, wider than normal human feet, and the toes were too far apart, almost like an animal's, but not quite. The ground was too dry to tell much, but they went off toward the trees and vanished after a few yards. I didn't want to overthink it. I told myself maybe a hiker got lost or someone from a nearby ranch had wandered through at night. Still, I started keeping a hatchet beside my bed after that. A few nights later, something happened that made me decide to leave. It was just after 2 a.m. when Murphy started barking, sharp and fast. I sat up and listened, footsteps again, running this time, circling the cabin in short bursts, stopping, then starting again. My heart was pounding. I reached for the flashlight and shined it through the front window. There was something standing just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't moving, just watching. Its body looked thin, too long in the limbs, and it stood hunched like it was trying to balance itself. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I caught the outline of something wrong about its head. Too small for the body, and the skin around the neck looked stretched, almost torn. Murphy barked harder, and the thing tilted its head toward the sound, slowly, like it was studying him. Then it made a noise, not quite a growl, not quite a human sound either, something in between. It was the kind of sound that makes your stomach turn cold because your mind can't place it. Took one step closer, and I saw its skin, pale, dirty, and hanging loose like it didn't fit right. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my flashlight, slammed the door shut, and pulled Murphy close. The footsteps moved again, fast, circling the cabin once more before fading into the woods. The next morning, I didn't even pack properly. I threw what I could into the truck, tied down the rest, and left before the sun was fully up. I didn't look back, not once. The road out felt longer than it did coming in. Every shadow between the trees looked like something watching. When I reached town, I stopped at a small gas station to fill up. The guy working there noticed the scratches on my truck's door. Long, uneven marks like something had clawed at it. He asked what happened. I told him it was probably a wild animal. He didn't say anything for a second, then nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the marks. Before I left, he said something that stuck with me. He said a lot of animals out there aren't what they seem at night. That night, back in my apartment in Flagstaff, I sat with Murphy asleep beside me, trying to convince myself it was all just an animal. Maybe a sick coyote or some kind of human I didn't understand. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the shape of it. Those long limbs, the way its skin hung loose, and the way it moved around the cabin like it knew me, like it had been watching for a while. A week later, out of curiosity, I looked up the property again. The listing was gone. The owner's number didn't work anymore. I searched for news about the area, thinking maybe someone else had seen something. Nothing came up, no stories, no reports, no photos. Just silence. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm out walking Murphy late and I catch a sound in the distance that doesn't fit. A whistle, a dragging step, or breathing that sounds too slow to belong to any animal I know. Whatever that thing was, I don't think it was some kind of legend or myth. I think it was something that learned how to mimic, how to blend, how to wear something else's skin. And I think it had been wearing mine for a while, watching me from the dark, waiting for me to stay just a little longer out there alone. That's why I never go near the woods at night anymore. I don't need to. I've seen what's out there, and it's not a story people tell. It's something that's still moving through those trees, still breathing, still watching, waiting for someone else who wants to be alone. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from city life and head out to a small cabin I had rented in northern Montana. I was 31 back then, working long hours at a logistics company in Billings, and I had been running on fumes for months. The cabin was isolated, about 8 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by nothing but pines, dry grass, and old hunting trails that led to nowhere. I wanted quiet. No traffic, no people, no ringing phone. Just silence. The cabin was old but sturdy, built sometime in the 1960s. It had 2 rooms, a small bedroom with a single bed and a main area with a wood stove, a table, and a narrow window that looked out toward the forest. The owner had told me there was no cell service up there, but there was a landline for emergencies, though he warned it didn't always work right. That didn't bother me. I thought I could use a week without any connection to the outside world. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking the area, taking short trails that led to creeks and small hills. The air was clean, the nights were cold, and the stars felt impossibly bright compared to the city's haze. I'd brought a cooler with food, a few cans of beer, and a small generator to charge my flashlight and camera batteries. Everything went as planned. But on the 4th day, things started to feel off. It wasn't one big thing, just a buildup of small, strange details. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and notice how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but heavy. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Usually, the woods were filled with the hum of insects or distant animal noises. But on those nights, it felt like everything had left. The first time I really felt uneasy was around dusk that evening. I was sitting outside on the small porch, eating a sandwich, watching the light fade between the trees. That's when I saw something out past the tree line. A small flicker of movement. I thought it was a deer at first, maybe an elk. I kept still, expecting to see it walk out, but it didn't. The trees just moved slightly, like something had brushed against them. The shadows were long by then, and I couldn't see clearly, but I had the strong feeling that whatever it was hadn't gone away. I told myself it was an animal and went back inside. Still, before sleeping, I dragged one of the kitchen chairs over and wedged it under the doorknob, something I'd never done before. It wasn't fear exactly, just instinct. The next morning, I found footprints near the porch steps. They weren't boot prints, they were bare. The dirt around the porch was dry and dusty, and I could see the shape clearly, the outline of a human foot, maybe a man's, because it was longer and wider than mine. The stride was odd too. The steps were uneven, like whoever it was had been limping or dragging one leg. I stood there for a long time looking at those tracks. I tried to come up with a reason for them, maybe a local passing through, maybe someone hunting, maybe a prank. But it didn't make sense. There were no other footprints leading to or from the porch, just those few faint marks right near the steps, like someone had stood there for a while, watching. The rest of the day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I didn't go hiking. I kept the generator off to save fuel, and I mostly stayed inside, reading an old magazine I'd brought along. Around noon, I heard something again. A thump, not loud, but heavy, coming from the direction of the woods. I looked out the window and didn't see anything. The sound came again, faint and irregular, like someone hitting wood with something dull. By late afternoon, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my backpack with essentials, water, knife, flashlight, and the small revolver I kept in my car for road trips. I planned to stay one more night and leave in the morning. I didn't want to drive the rough trail at night. When darkness came, the air felt different, thick, almost damp. The moonlight was faint behind clouds, but I could still make out the edges of the clearing. I turned off the lights and sat near the window watching. Nothing moved at first, just the trees swaying. Then I noticed something near the tree line again. A dark figure, standing still. I could tell it was human-shaped, tall, maybe 6 feet, but it wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. I remember thinking that maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but the longer I looked, the more I could see it. The faint outline of arms, a head, the stillness of it. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just waited. After what felt like an hour, I finally went to bed. I didn't sleep much. Every small noise made my heart pound. Around 2 a.m., I heard faint footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful. The wood creaked under weight. Then, a soft scrape, like nails or fingers dragging along the wall. I stayed in bed, gripping the handle of the revolver under my blanket, listening. The footsteps moved to the far side of the cabin, then faded. When daylight came, I went outside carefully. There were more footprints now, clearer ones, right below the window. The same bare feet, one of them slightly crooked, as if the person was dragging their foot. I followed them a little way toward the woods, but they vanished on the hard ground. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded my bags into the car and turned the ignition. As I drove off the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. For a long stretch, all I saw were trees and dust. Then, just as I rounded a bend, I thought I saw someone standing near the tree line again, far back, half hidden in the shade. I didn't stop to look. When I got back to town, I went straight to a diner and called the cabin owner from the payphone outside. The line crackled as it connected. I told him about the footprints, about someone being around the cabin at night. He was quiet for a bit, then said something like, "Asterisk, you did the right thing leaving early. Sometimes folks wander through out there." Asterisk, that's all he said. A week later, he called me back. He told me he'd gone up to check on the place. Said he found signs someone had been living in the woods behind the property. A small makeshift shelter made from branches and old plastic sheets, bits of food wrappers, and torn clothes. He said it looked abandoned, like whoever had been there left in a hurry. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I picture that shape in the dark, the way it just stood there without moving. I think about those bare footprints, the slow dragging steps, the sound of someone circling the cabin while I lay awake inside. I stopped going on solo trips after that. I still like the woods, but I never stay anywhere that far off the map anymore. I need to see another house nearby, or hear a road, or know there's someone within shouting distance. That cabin reminded me of something simple but unsettling, that when you're far enough from everything, when the night is that deep and the silence that thick, you don't really know who else might be out there. And sometimes, whoever it is doesn't want to be found. It had been 8 years since I last saw that cabin. 8 years since I packed up my things from that place after the divorce, leaving behind memories that still burned somewhere deep inside me like old scars that wouldn't fade. My ex-husband, Mark, passed away last winter. Heart attack, they said. He was only 54. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't even call anyone. I found out from a mutual friend who sent a short message that felt more like an update than condolences. A month after that, a letter came in the mail. His brother had sent it, explaining that Mark's will listed me as the sole inheritor of the cabin in northern Montana, near Flathead Lake. I didn't even know he'd kept it. I figured he would have sold it or let it rot away. But the letter said it was mine now. I could do whatever I wanted with it. Sell it, keep it, burn it down for all anyone cared. For weeks, I ignored it. But something about that cabin kept scratching at the back of my mind. I tried to move on from that part of my life years ago, but curiosity always finds a way to crawl back in. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to face the place that had witnessed the slow decay of my marriage. Or maybe I just wanted to see if anything was left. Something that could remind me who I used to be before things went so wrong. So in early September of 2023, I packed my truck and drove north. It took most of the day, through long stretches of pine forests and empty 2-lane highways. The sky had that cold blue color that comes right before fall, when the air smells faintly of wood smoke and wet dirt. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. The last 20 miles were nothing but trees and gravel road, with my headlights cutting through the dust. When I finally reached the cabin, it felt smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged slightly on one end, and the paint on the door had peeled away almost completely. The windows were dusty, and there were weeds growing through the steps. It was exactly as I left it, only older, quieter, more forgotten. I parked near the old stump by the driveway and sat in the truck for a while before getting out. The air smelled sharp, like pine needles and old rain. The forest surrounded everything, thick, unmoving, silent. There was no wind, no sound, just that kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Inside, it smelled like old wood and mildew. Dust floated in the sunlight that came through the cracks in the blinds. The furniture was all still there, the same worn couch, the same coffee table with the ring marks from beer bottles. Even the clock above the kitchen sink had stopped at 3:47, probably years ago. I walked through each room slowly, trying to remember where everything used to be. The bedroom still had the dent in the floor where Mark dropped a hammer one night during a fight. The kitchen cabinets still squeaked the same way when I opened them. There were old canned goods, expired a decade ago, and a few dishes still in the sink, like someone had just left in a hurry. In the back room, I found his things. Boxes stacked against the wall, sealed with duct tape and dust. I didn't open them at first. I just stood there, staring. There was something about those boxes that made me uneasy. Not scared exactly, just unsettled. Like opening them would mean stepping back into a life I'd already buried. But later that evening, After I lit a few candles and made some instant coffee on the stove, I went back and started opening them. Most were filled with tools, old clothes, papers, tax forms, bills, a few notebooks full of handwriting I recognized but didn't want to read. One box, though, was different. Inside were photos, a camera, and a few VHS tapes wrapped in plastic. The photos were mostly of the cabin and the land around it. But there were others, shots of me from years ago. Me cooking in the kitchen, sitting on the porch, stacking firewood. I didn't even remember him taking those. The pictures stopped around 2014, the year I left. I didn't have a VHS player, but I found an old one still plugged into the TV in the corner of the living room. The wires were covered in dust, but it worked when I turned it on. I played the first tape. The video showed the cabin's exterior from different angles, like he was documenting something. He'd zoom in on the woods, then the driveway, then the windows. The next tape was almost the same, just slow shots of trees, the shed, the lake in the distance. No sound, no talking, just static wind noise and silence. Then came the third tape. This one was different. It started with a shot of the front yard, filmed at night. The camera shook slightly, like someone was holding it while breathing hard. The porch light flickered in the frame. Then it moved toward the woods slowly. I could hear faint breathing. The lens focused on the tree line. For a long time, nothing moved. Then there was something, just a shape, hard to see, but it was there between the trees. Not a person, not an animal, just a figure, tall and still. The video cut out after that. I rewound it, thinking maybe it was just a shadow, but it was there again. The outline of something or someone standing near the woods. My chest felt tight. I stopped the tape and sat there for a while, listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing things. Small sounds, like twigs breaking or footsteps in the dirt outside. Every time I looked through the window, there was nothing there. Just darkness and the outline of the trees against the faint glow of the sky. By morning, I was exhausted. I decided I'd clean up the place, take whatever I needed, and leave by noon. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, big ones, leading from the tree line to the porch. They weren't mine. I froze there for a while, staring at them. The prints were wide and deep, like someone wearing heavy boots. They stopped right at the steps, then turned back toward the woods. I didn't see any car tracks, no tire marks, just those prints. I packed my bag immediately, shoving everything into the truck. Before I left, I took one last look at the cabin. The front door hung slightly open now. I was sure I'd closed it last night. Inside, one of the boxes I'd opened was on its side, the papers scattered. I didn't go back in. I just stood there long enough to see it before getting into the truck and starting the engine. The drive out felt longer than the way in. The road seemed tighter, the trees closer. Every sound made me tense up. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. I never went back. A few weeks later, I listed the cabin for sale. A local buyer took it off my hands quickly. A retired couple who wanted something quiet. I never mentioned the tapes or the footprints. I threw the tapes away in a dumpster before I left Montana. Still, sometimes when I'm half asleep, I think about that third tape, about the shape standing in the trees and how it never moved. I think about those fresh prints outside the cabin door and how they weren't there the night before. Mark had been dead for 6 months when I found them, and I still don't know who or what came to the cabin that night after I did. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. Not then, and maybe not even now, because sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear that same slow crunch of footsteps outside my window, moving closer then stopping just before the door.